Hello, everybody. Peter Maravellis here. Welcome to City Lights Live, the virtual reading series that follows in the footsteps of our in-store calendar during the time of the pandemic. We are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush peoples, from where we continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love with readings, discussions, and forums moving into the winter solstice and hopefully towards a COVID-free era. Tonight, we are delighted to be celebrating the launch of a landmark publication. We are pleased to have with us Nancy Perloff discussing the subject of her new book titled Concrete Poetry, a 21st Century Anthology. It is published by Reaktion Books in the UK, who are an independent publisher of innovative nonfiction. And Concrete Poetry is a highly curated and wide-ranging anthology. Ms. Perloff has thoroughly chosen work that really thoughtfully chosen work that exemplifies the poets whom she believes are especially distinctive and significant and who represent the strengths of the concrete poetry movement. Nancy Perloff is a curator of modern and contemporary collections at the Getty Research Institute. Her scholarship addresses the Russian avant-garde, European modernism, and the relationship between music and the visual arts. Her exhibitions include Monuments of the Future, designs by Ella Zitsky, also Sea Tales, a video collaboration, Tango with Cows, book art of the Russian avant-garde from 1910 through 1917, and World War I, War of Images, Images of War, for which she led the curatorial team. Ms. Perloff is the author of Art and the Everyday, Popular Entertainment and the Circle of Eric Satie, also Explodity, Sound, Image, and the Word in Russian Futurist Book Art. She is also a co-editor with Brian M. Reed of the book Situating Ella Zitsky. Her anthology of concrete poetry grew out of a recent GRI exhibition, Concrete Poetry, Words and Sounds in Graphic Space. Ms. Perloff will be joined tonight by Antonio Sergio Bessa. Mr. Bessa is Chief Curator Emeritus at the Bronx Museum of the Arts. He is also an adjunct professor at the Columbia University's Teachers College, where he teaches museum education issues. A distinguished scholar of concrete poetry, Mr. Bessa has organized several critically acclaimed exhibitions on the themes related to text-based art. So really very, very honored to have the both of them with us here tonight. Please now join us in giving a warm welcome to Nancy Perloff and Antonio Sergio Bessa. Welcome to City Lights Live.
Thank you, Peter. It's wonderful to be here with everyone. I see some friends. I already see Marjorie. Hello, Marjorie. So nice to see you. And
hi, Sheldon.
And Nancy, thank you so much for inviting me. We've been talking about this book for quite a few years. I can say that I followed the development of the book, and I'm very pleased to see the final result. The Reaktion did a really great job with the printing. The book looks really fantastic, and I look forward to talking about some of the aspects of the book. But I thought that just to give a little bit of context to our talk, I would just remind our listeners what exactly was the concrete poetry movement. Nancy, you can kind of come and complement my thoughts, but I was thinking that we maybe can divide in two waves. This, of course, was a poetic movement that came in the post-war. And the first wave was basically starting in Brazil in the early 1950s, Switzerland, and Sweden. And it's very interesting that in the beginning, some of these players, they were working separately and not knowing of what each other's work. So someone like Eugen Faustrom, for example, who wrote a fantastic, I wouldn't call a manifesto. It was an essay that was released in Mimeograph magazine in 1953. At the time, he didn't even title Manifesto for Concrete Poetry. It was only in the 60s that he retrospectively retitled his text. But he came up with this very interesting essay about a new mode of creating poetry. And this was really in there was a lot of connections with what was the thinking that was going on in Brazil at the time. And of course, these poets, they had no way to communicate. They didn't know each other. There was no internet. Everything was in the mail. Only a few years later was one of the Brazilian poets met Eugen Gomringer in Switzerland. And there was a very good kind of rapport between these poets, and they decided to launch the international concrete poetry movement. So I would say that that's very much the first phase, the first wave. And then there is a second wave, which is when the work of these pioneers become more known, and then they reach out to other poets. So the second wave include poets in Scotland like Ian Hamilton Finlay, and Nancy, you included his work, which is really seminal. You included in your anthology. Also some other poets in England, people working in Cambridge. But then there was also people like in Iceland, Roth, who now he's more known for his visual work, paintings, sculptures, but Dieter was very agent in kind of spreading these new ideas related to poetry. And then Germany, Japan, I think we're gonna talk about Japan, and Eastern Europe. So this second wave was very spread out, and then led to some very interesting anthologies. So there is the anthology of Stephen Bann, which it's a book that we all go back to. It's one of the first anthologies. And then there was the voluminous book that Mary Ellen Salt did when she was a professor at Bloomington. And to this day, it's still a Bible for people who are interested in the subject. And then the really beautiful book by Emmett Williams that he did with Something Else Press here in New York. And now your book, Nancy, kind of entered this pantheon of anthologies of concrete poetry. And my first question to you is exactly this: why an anthology of concrete poetry now in 2023, which is very much 70 years after the start of this movement?
Yes. First of all, thank you, Sergio, for joining me tonight. It's a great pleasure and honor to discuss the book with you. And thank you for this survey, this overview, because it is fascinating to think that initially in the early 50s, when the Brazilians were really inventing a new kind of language, a new kind of poem, that no one knew one another, that it took until maybe later in the 50s when they met for the first time in Germany. Eugen Gomringer was the foundational figure there, that they exchanged and began to understand what was happening, and that it was what they called a transnational movement, not just an international movement. And we'll talk about that idea of transnational. But let me answer Sergio's question first, which is why a new anthology of concrete poetry now? I would say that today we find ourselves in a moment when we can look back at the core decades of concrete poetry, that is the 1950s through the 70s, and we can make critical judgments about who the leading and truly innovative poets were. We have a kind of vantage, a perspective now. Sergio mentioned the early anthologies, and we need to remember that those were published in the late 60s, so that's a long time ago. So today, I found that it was an opportunity to go back and look at the decades of concrete poetry and really try to make a certain call as to who really were the leading and truly innovative poets. This involved expanding the field. And I want to say that kind of carefully. What I mean by that is that it was time to include the Austrians, not just one poem by an Austrian poet, but a number of poems by Austrian poets. It was time to include the Japanese poets who had been included very sparingly. So there was this feeling that I had that it was time to expand the field in terms of including cultures, countries that had not really been addressed, that had been treated more as lesser figures, and to do that by being both more comprehensive on one level, but also more selective on another level. The anthologies of the late 60s, Mary Ellen Solt, Emmett Williams, Stephen Bann were the first. So they were very important, but they were very inclusive. Every poem by every poet was somehow part of these anthologies. So my goal here was to be more selective and at the same time expand the field, as I said. So I had two big challenges. One, whom do I select and by what criteria? And two, how do I organize my selections? Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, the organization, a little bit later in our conversation, but I do want to mention that, as Peter said, this anthology grew out of an exhibition that I curated at the Getty Research Institute. It was called Concrete Poetry, Words and Sounds in Graphic Space, and this was spring 2017. There is a website if you're interested. And I should also say that many of the objects that I showed in that exhibition belong to the Getty Research Institute collections. We have extraordinary collections of concrete poetry, and this was a wonderful opportunity for me. So you have a book, of course, this anthology, which is very different from an exhibition. A book is not limited by gallery walls. One can create a wider range of poets, and one can look more deeply in the work of each. Another aspect as far as why a new anthology, and I did feel very strongly about this, that I wanted to include critical and scholarly commentaries, not commentaries by the poets, but rather my own commentaries. And my goal was to open a window on how we can read concrete poetry and how to explicate the subtleties of its language and its visual and semantic density. That might sound strange, semantic density, because when we look at the poems, you'll see they're often 2 or 3 words or maybe 5 words, but they may look easy, playful, accessible, but they're often quite difficult to understand. The language is minimal. And so my goal with the commentaries was really to give people a kind of insight into how to understand the concrete poem, how to read it, how to interpret it. And of course, I did this with limited space, but that was another goal as far as why a new anthology.
I think this is really good point. And I was thinking this distinction that you make between Bann's anthology and Mary Ellen's anthology and yours. I remember speaking with Mary Ellen and about how she amassed all, because it's very impressive, all the material that she gathered. Yeah. And actually Mary Ellen, when I met her, her memory was already, kind of deficient, but her daughter, Susan Salt, told me that she remembered that her mother would receive tons of mail from Europe and from South America, because all of a sudden, other poets knew that she was preparing an anthology, and people were very keen on being in that anthology. So that's my point, is that I think probably Mary Ellen kind of exercised very little kind of discretion. She was just so excited in discovering all this material, yeah. And which was basically offered to her. So in your point, in your moment now, you have this ability to kind of step back and look at what happened and then do your selection. And I was thinking also, Nancy, that another factor that it's very interesting is that you are not a poetry scholar, so that's not your background, but you are a curator. And I feel, looking at your book and looking at Mary Ellen's book, it's very clear that this is a curatorial project. Although you say that this is not the book of the exhibition that you did, I think it benefited from your process as a curator to research the subject, and also this idea of working with archives, which is something that you have done at the Getty for many years. Can you comment a little bit about that?
Yeah, I love that question, because when Sergio mentioned this to me, I didn't really, it's not that I thought I was a poetry scholar. Of course, my background is different, as you said, but I hadn't really thought about how my curatorial training and work shaped this book. And I think it's a really interesting question. I'm going to start with something that's almost seems basic, but I think it's really important. And that's that in all of my exhibitions that I've done at the Getty Research Institute, I have focused on something very straightforward. Is this image visually compelling? Would somebody want to come back and look at it again? Is it striking? Will it entice visitors through the exhibition? And what I've done with this anthology is similar. I've tried to select work that has a very strong visual presence that will instill a desire in the reader to return to that poem again, something striking. So that's one basic practice. Another is that, of course, as a curator, I write didactic panels or labels, or none of those words are ever really very good in terms of describing what a curator does. But when I got to the commentaries, which I've already discussed, I was very influenced by writing text for exhibitions. And I was concerned that it be succinct, that it be accessible to the visitor, that it helped them, give them a path in terms of understanding how to read the poem. It might provide historical or cultural context, depends on what poem you're talking about, but that was an important goal. Another aspect of the curatorial is that when you're in an exhibition, you can compare and contrast works on the wall because you're there in the middle of the exhibition, and you can walk to one wall, walk to another, go back and forth, and have this sense of the whole. Obviously, in a book, a reader can't do that. You're moving page to page. But what I've tried to do is create sections in the book. Some have to do with the leading three poets we're going to talk about: Augusto, Ian Hamilton Finlay, Geraldo. Others are nationalities, but I'm hoping that people will be inspired maybe to move from Augusto de Campos to the section on Brazil, and then perhaps the section on Japan, because there was this friendship between Geraldo and Kitasono Katue that was very fundamental. So there's a way in which you can flip back and forth and make comparisons, not quite like being in an exhibition, but certainly something that I've thought about. The other thing that I wanted to just mention is, how did I organize this anthology? Because this was a big challenge. And if you look at the early anthologies, the ones from the late 60s, they tend to be alphabetical or chronological. The problem with both of those is you have very abrupt shifts from, Finlay to, I don't know, somebody who also has a name beginning with F, but bears no relationship to Finlay. So alphabetical didn't seem to make sense, and chronological didn't really seem to make sense. I was more interested in nationality, and that's what I tended to focus on. At first, what I did was I tried to choose journals. I thought maybe a really interesting way to organize it would be by individual journals within each country. So in Brazil, Noigandres, Invenção; in Scotland, Poor Old Tired Tired Horse, in Germany, Futura, in Switzerland, Concrete Poesie, in France, Germany, Material. There were a lot of, in Japan, Vow, there were a lot of enticing ways in which journals might have presented a way to organize the anthology. But of course, what happened was it didn't account for everyone. There were too many poets left who didn't join a journal or collaborate on a journal. So the journal idea, as interesting as it was something I took up in the introduction, but not something I used as an organizing frame. So what I did do is I decided to organize the anthology around 3 key figures who I felt transformed the genre. And that was the Brazilian Augusto de Campos, the Austrian Gerhard Rühm, and the Scottish poet Ian Hamilton Finlay. And my argument was that they epitomized the defining role for concrete poetry of countries existing on the peripheries of the cultures that were dominant during the Second World War. So that if you think about the revival of the avant-garde after the Second World War, it really occurred not in the war capitals, but on the periphery in Sweden, Switzerland, Austria, Scotland, Brazil. So these 3 poets represented that and then led me towards a focus on nationalities that supported their work as well as moved in new directions.
This is really fascinating. I had a hunch that the curatorial, your background as a curator kind of informed your book, but it's very interesting to hear your choices and your process. But I was also thinking, Nancy, because we are talking about a poetry that aims to be very vocal visual. So the sound is very important. And I know that as a curator and as a writer and organizer of books, music has always been a major focus for you, whether it's Satie or I remember years ago we met in New York and I think you were in the process of acquiring David Tudor's archives. So you have a knowledge of music and particularly of, let's say, avant-garde music. And I wonder how that kind of, if that played any role in your particularly with the Austrians, because they do a lot of sound play, correctly? But Faustron did, and we're going to see the Brazilians also there. But what was your take on that?
Yeah, so that's really interesting because I did have a section of the concrete poetry exhibition at the Getty that was called The Sound of Concrete Poetry. And there I included Augusto de Campos, of course, and also the other Brazilians, Geraldo, his brother, was a great poet, and Décio Pinatari played a lesser role in terms of sound. But what I also learned doing that is that Finlay was a little trickier. And when we get to the PowerPoint, we have some slides and some sound. It's interesting to look at the role of sound in Finlay versus the role of sound in Augusto and in the Austrians, and to some extent in the Japanese. But just to say a few words about sound and then a little bit about Tudor. I did an article in Marjorie Perloff's and Craig Dworkin's book, The Sound of Poetry, The Poetry of Sound, where I looked at the relationship between sound poetry and the musical avant-garde. And I argued that critical writing on sound poetry had been the domain of poets and literary scholars who study its semantic, syntactic, and linguistic attributes, and that this seemed appropriate because the sound poet begins with a text of some kind. And certainly, if you think of the early avant-gardes, the Russian avant-garde, the Italian futurists, sound poetry was a hybrid form created by poets. Yet, I also wanted to emphasize that an effective analysis of a sound poet's text must also consider its realization in live performance. Sound poetry, by definition, also needs to be heard. It needs to be performed. And so the musicologist part of my background, became really interested in that whole role, that idea of live performance. And there are incredible examples, you know, the most immediate I think of is Christian Book, but many other great performers of sound poetry. And then the other part of sound poetry is just the whole nature of sounds themselves, their intelligibility, their role in articulating structure. So the importance of sound poems or sound poetry as hybrid forms that also are very much tied to sound, of course. And then another thing that Sergio had mentioned to me that I can just mention briefly is when I did my book on explodity, word, image, and sound in Russian futurist book art. That was fascinating because the verbivoco-visual, which originally comes from James Joyce and was taken up by the Brazilian poets in the early 50s, from Finnegan's Wake, the Russian avant-garde books, the Russian futurist books, were based on this idea of zaum. Zaum, it's a wonderful word. It's a sound word. Za, beyond, the mind. So transrational poetry, transrational word. And what happened in creating zaum poems or zaum poetry was one heard neologisms, one heard morphemes, one heard surprising juxtapositions of words, often not conveying meaning in any traditional sense, but the phonic presence coupled with the visual design and the reading of word and image conveyed this array of associations, verbi, voco, visual. So for the Russian futurists, it was not only the word as such, which was their famous manifesto, but also, to quote Roman Jakobson, the sound as such. Its presence in futurist book art transformed what was essentially verbal visual medium into an auditory one. And, you know, I really argue in that book that futurist books are meant to be heard, not merely read. And I just have to quickly read or speak one of the great Klebnikov poems because sound is so clearly pivotal to the whole nature of this poem. It means our cabbage head is very, very worried. The sharpened knife is very, very sharp. Nash kuchen ochen azabochen, noj atochen, tochen ochen. And there's a great translation by Paul Schmidt. Let us all be heads of lettuce. Let us not let knives upset us. Brilliant translation. But there we go with the whole verbivoco visual in the Russian avant-garde. And then finally, just to mention David Tudor, the pianist, American pianist and live electronic composer, whose archive is at the Getty Research Institute. And he was really interested in sound as material, sound as abstract materiality. He wanted to create new musical instruments. Just as in sound poetry, there are new kinds of vocal languages or sounds. Tudor was exploring musical instruments. So his Rainforest 4, which dates from 1973, is a performed installation in which composers design and construct up to 5 sculptures, which function as instrumental loudspeakers, and each composer independently produces sound material that displays the sculpture's resonant characteristics. So this is just a glimpse quick into David Tudor and my interest in sound. We actually recreated a version of Rainforest 4. It's gone on, it's at MoMA now in a later version, Rainforest 5, and it's all about sound and transformations of sound electronically.
Well, thank you so much for this. I had to ask about David Tudor because, of course, you know, the Brazilians, they're very interested in John Cage,
yeah,
particularly Augusto de Campos, but Faustrom was also very interested in John Cage. And Faustrom, they're also very interested in Pierre Boulez and Pierre Schaeffer and electronic music, what they call musique concrète, and so that was all a big part of that. And I know that kind of, in a sense, kind of connects with your research. So I know that you mentioned a little bit about this in the beginning, but I just wanna bring this up, bring this back again about the selection. Why this selection? Just pretend that you're not talking just to me. Well, you're not talking just to me, but for someone who hasn't seen the book yet, just tell us what this person is going to find in the book and what is your rationale for doing the selection.
What is my rationale?
Mm-hmm.
Did you say? Yeah. I would say that I wanted to, first of all, it had to be a spotlight on the three poets I've mentioned, because their work is in its own league. And also the three are quite different. So whereas with Rinne, one looks more at very, very spare poetry with just sometimes letters and combinations of letters. And also Rinne was a composer. I mean, that was his first métier. He was a composer. His father was a double bassist in the Vienna Philharmonic. I mean, he came from a musical background. Augusto is really a polymath. I mean, he's a musician, he's a poet, he's a visual artist. So he sits in his own really extraordinary terrain and continues to work up until the very present day, as does Geraldo. Finlay passed away in 2006, went through many, many different stages and phases and periods, was most known and is most known today for his garden, for Little Sparta, which is outside of Edinburgh. And if you mention the name Ian Hamilton Finlay to people in the visual arts or in poetry, mostly they immediately know Little Sparta, which contains sculpture bearing the words and the languages of his concrete poetry, but also moving beyond his work in the 60s to something much more political. So those three poets I knew were a centerpiece. And then I followed from there. And I really do have to say, this book in its final selection was collaborative. John Solt introduced the Japanese poets to me and made it clear how they can be read, how they can be understood. And I included more than I would ever have anticipated I'd be able to do because I had his guidance and his expertise. Michael Lehman, my publisher of Reaktion, he had very strong feelings about balance. And so we went back and forth on Gomringer, Eugen Gomringer, who initially I represented with just a few poems. And Michael Lehman said, no, he's a foundational figure. You really have to have a good representation of Gomringer. He also, Michael Lehman felt very strongly about Dieter Roth being a figure, granted, maybe more known in the visual art world than in poetry, but what he did in Roth, that incredible book with typography and poetry, is really rather extraordinary. And so Michael Lehman was very keen. Similarly, Dom Sylvester Huidar, who I didn't know that well, Lehman felt needed to be represented. So it was collaborative. My mother knew the Austrian poetry, and she really opened that up in a way that allowed me to bring in humor, because there's a lot of humor in the Austrian poetry. There also is in the other work, in other works as well. So I would just say my best answer is that the final selection was refined by collaboration, by discussion with people, with colleagues, friends, people who felt strongly. And of course, no matter what, you're never going to make everybody happy. That's the nature of an anthology. And so I have to, in the end, say this is my selection and I stand by it.
But at the same time, having those three poets as the core and then everything radiating from that. I think that's a very nice way to kind of describe the project. So I think now maybe we should show some of the examples that you selected from your book.
Yes, that'd be great. I think we need Peter Maravelas to allow me to share the screen, or maybe he's already allowed me to do that. Let's see. Share sound. Okay. Okay, that's the cover of the book for people who haven't seen the book yet, and I certainly hope you will. Let's see. Oh, there we go. So we're starting with a poem by Geraldo de Campos. And he was a theoretician, he was a translator, and he was a poet. He was really a great figure, and he's included, of course, represented by a number of poems in the anthology. I thought it would be wonderful if Sergio read this. And then, Sergio, please feel free to talk a little bit about it, and I can add or not as we go.
Yeah. So I think this is one of the most beautiful poems by Geraldo from this phase. This is the from 1958, so it's the heroic phase of the concrete poetry. The first thing that you have to acknowledge here is the design, and the design is very architectural. It's a little bit, you know, perhaps inspired by some of the shapes of the buildings in Brasilia, who is about to be unveiled in just a few years. So you have all the words kind of encased by this kind of architectural, very strict architectural structure. But then the poem talks about birth, rebirth, and death in very minimal way. So in English, I think the translation would be, if one is born, one dies, and then he repeats and repeats, and then reborns, re-dies. Of course, that word doesn't exist in English, but in Portuguese, you have a lot of poetic license to play with words like that. And then the second part at the bottom, he adds the prefix D, so like in deconstruction, so it's dinasce, desnasce, or desmorre, so it's undie, unborn, and so forth. So it's just playing with these very simple words and complicating just by the repetition and using of prefix and so forth. So a reading of this could be, se nasce, morre, nasce, morre, nasce, morre, renasce, remorre, renasce, remorre, renasce, renasce, remorre, desnasce, desmorre, desnasce, desmorre, desnasce, desmorre, nasce, morre, nasce, morre, nasce, morre-se.
Lovely. The architectural structure is really very pronounced, so that's really interesting. And what about, Sergio, just before we move on, why se? What's the importance of that? What role does that play?
Well, the se here is when the verb in Portuguese becomes reflexive. Mm-hmm. So it's like one. It's very hard to translate that in English terms, but then the same word se can also be translated as if. Mm-hmm. So it has this double kind of meaning. It's a part of the reflexive tense, but it's also a conditional. So
fascinating.
And
Thank
this
you.
is the kind of thing that they played a lot at the time, just kind of, playing with these very simple words and ideas, but then kind of undermining the grammar through this kind of, display. So.
Thank you. Sorry. Okay, this is a poem by Augusto de Campos, which he titles SOS. We're going to hear it because Augusto later, I think beginning in the 80s, but maybe roughly that time, maybe a little later, he started to animate his concrete poetry. And by animate, I mean literally that the words move, the letters move, and there's usually a sound component, which is very striking. And in this poem, that's particularly true. So I thought first Sergio can read the Portuguese while you see the screen, and you can follow the English translation, and then we can listen to SOS.
Yes, so the first line has the word I in several languages, and I have to apologize because I don't speak Russian, so I don't know how to pronounce the
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it goes ego, eu, I, ich, eu, je, eu, I. Nós, sós, vós, que faremos após, sem sol, sem mãe, sem pai, na noite que anoitece, vagaremos sem voz, silenciosos, sós.
And SOS is the emergency, right? The
SOS is he plays here with the SOS, so it's a cry for help, but also SOS means we are alone. So the last line, silenciosos, SOS, silently we are alone.
We are alone. Okay, thank you for adding that. Let's try listening. Okay.
Ego, eu, ja, ich, io, je, I. Ego, eu, ja, ich, io, je, I. Nós, eu, sós, ich, ios, nós, sós, vós. Que faremos após? Que faremos após? Sem sol faremos sem após. Sem mar, sem sol, sem mãe, sem mar, sem noite que anoitece. Na noite que anoitece, na vaga noite que sem voz, vagaremos sem voz, vagaremos sem voz, silencioso SOS.
Hmm. I don't know what that yellow thing is, but anyway, that's really a haunting poem. We used it to close the Concrete Poetry exhibition and to show the contrast between Augusto and Ian Hamilton Finlay in the garden. So it was very, I think, an effective comparison or contrast. This is a poem I'm just going to mention very briefly. This is Augusto de Campos, Sem número, without a number. And there have been multiple interpretations of this. My main point with this poem is that it's very spare, without a number, number, zero. Means or the, the, numero, sem número. Augusto takes that idea of zero. We see actually circles on either side of the text, which reinforce the idea of zero or but there are also puns. Same in Portuguese, CEM is 100, same is without. So Augusto is working a little bit with multiple meanings of words. Sergio, do you have anything to add to that?
I think this poem, like the previous one, and pretty much everything that Augusto has done, has a very strong focus on negativity. So here is the, someone without a number. So it's unidentified. It's and he plays quite a lot with that. And not in this one, but the previous one that you showed, he also talks about this idea of a person who doesn't have a voice. And this is so, this goes throughout his whole poetry. Since even before the poems from the concrete phase, he was already talking about this issue of negativity, of in the case of this poem, he is like this character, the subject, the poetic guy, is a zero, right? So there is this kind of debasement that runs throughout his, and it's a very kind of poignant kind of subject in his work. So, but then again, you have the architecture of it. There is a twist to this axis here. You could even see that's something that later he's going to be very interested, which is this. I think he has a son who's a physicist, and he's very interested in theories based on physics and quasars and black holes and so forth. And when I see this poem, there is the idea of the zero, of the number, the odd number, but also it's almost like a physics kind of structure, kind of being worked, that it's almost on the verge of disappearing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I think also, just I'll mention that the translations that I have on the screen, same, etc., is what I try to do throughout the anthology, which is to provide what I call glossaries. And the glossaries allow the reader to piece together some kind of meaning or interpretation, and then to read a commentary. But here, Augusto is using words that have multiple meanings, and this is something that Sergio mentioned that was important in the Geraldo poem as well, the kind of punning that goes on because of the beauty of the Portuguese language.
Yes, I think your translations, they're very helpful for a reader to approach this. And it's kind of a door into that, but there is quite more. One thing that I want to say about these two poems is that there was a lot of criticism to concrete poetry that it was just a formal kind of exercise, but for them, form is revolutionary. And they, in their manifesto, later they added this line by Mayakovsky that Mayakovsky, I think he wrote something, there is no revolution without revolutionary forms.
Okay. Okay, so this is a poem by Seiichi Nikuni called, in translation, River or Sand Bank. And you see there's two triangles, so there's a diagonal that divides the poem into two triangular parts. And on the left, we see a repeated character, which is the character for river. There are three adjacent lines moving downwards. So it suggests flowing water. It's very beautiful. And the character for river repeats. And then on the right, you'll notice that, in fact, the character is still there, river, but the poet has added three dots, and this signifies the character for sandbank. So we now have a picture, a visual picture of a river and sandbank that makes itself felt through the repetition of these two characters, so that the reader visualizes both ideas and at the same time focuses on the abstract forms of the characters. And I think what you gain from this is how these subtle shifts, this addition of the three dots, changes the meaning of the character. Here's another one by Seiichi Nikuni, very playful here, pictorial treatment of Japanese characters. So the character at the very top, in the top row, that's the character for head and neck, but it also means top. So we have to think we're creating an image of a building, and this is the top of the building. Then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 rows representing the character for eye. And also, if we think of a building again, we're looking into the building, and this is the eyes looking into the building. And then at the bottom here, we see these legs coming out, and this is the character for see, and Nikuni is visualizing the idea of people entering and exiting the building. And there is even a suggestion of a windowsill in that blank before the character for eye again. So very evocative. And the title of the poem is Window from 1968. And then my last Japanese example, Kitasono Katue, a poem called Magic. And this one has two ideographs. The one at the top corresponds to the word for ocean. And you'll see, it's hard to see in this a little bit, but two downward and one upward line, which represent the radical or character for ocean, or for water, I'm sorry. So we have two ideographs. One is showing the radical for water, and the other, the turning figure, or what looks like kind of an apostrophe, is indeed S, or what would be the equivalent of S in English. And so we have the idea of the waves rolling over the ocean surface. We have ocean and S, ocean and S, oceans, ocean, ocean, with the S connecting the word. And in Japanese, John Solt explained to me that this is a sonic poem. It does have a sound that corresponds to the waves rolling over the ocean bed. It would sound like umi, no 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 umi. And you have this repetition that's kind of hypnotic that suggests the ocean, the waves rolling over the ocean floor. And this is very early 1929, Kitasono Katue exploring concrete poetry well avant la lettre. Now we move to the Austrians. And here I have a poem by Gerhard Rühm called Wand, Bild, from 1954 to 64. So he worked on these poems over years, which is interesting. This one needs to be heard. I'm going to read it for you and listen for the rhymes that connect words through sound. Wand, 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 Wand. That's wall. Bild, Bild, Bild. Picture. Wand, 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 Wand. Bild, Bild, Bild. Wand, 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 Wand. Wild, Wild. Hand, Wild. Hand, Hand, Wild. Wund. So he's taking words like Wand and Bild that relate to one another, but he's also introducing rhymes. So Wild comes in to rhyme with Bild, Hand comes in to rhyme with Wand, and we realize that all of these words are connected. There's the idea of the picture on the wall and the hand, wild, somehow hitting something on the wall. And all we know is we have the last word of the poem, Wund, which means wound. Another poem by Gerhard Rühm, this one only one word, dicht, dicht. And that gets repeated and repeated, and the letters splay out until it's almost abstract and you're more occupied with letters than you are with word. But dicht, of course, is very evocative and has many connotations. It can mean thick or dense. It can evoke dichte, density, dichten, to write poetry, to poeticize, dichte, poet, dicht, gedicht, poem. So Gerhard Rühm is here using a minimalist approach to achieve a maximalist range of meanings. Here we have one by Gerhard Rühm that needs again to be heard. And the interesting thing here about this poem is it's ugly, it's deliberately harsh, and it's evoking other harsh words, even if they're not part of the poem. So it sounds like g, ig, sig, I, sh. Oh, and schlitzig is an invented word. G, ig, sig, I, sh, g, schl, schl, g, ig, schl, t, g, sh, t, g, schl, t, schl, t, g, c, g, sh, t, schl, t, sh, t, g, ig, I, schl, schl, t, gig, schl, t, gig, itz, litz, schlitz, schlitz, g, schlitz, I, g, zig, schlitzig. And it's very hard to read it, actually, but he's suggesting other words. Schmutzig, schlimm. Schmutzig means dirty, schlimm, naughty. We could also add new endings. Schlitzäugig, slit-eyed. Schlitzor, wily devil. All arise out of Schlitz. And finally, we're going to look at just a few Ian Hamilton Finlay. You'll see it's quite dramatically different from the poetry we've been looking at. This one is, let's see, reminding myself of the date, 63, to the painter Juan Gris. And the poem does warrant being heard aloud, I think. Happy apple. And then there's the blue eye, pip. Happy apple, pip. Pip might be the exuberant happiness of an apple, but why a happy apple? What is the relationship? They both have two P's, so there's a sonic and letter relationship, but the other is an allusion typical of Finlay to be alluding in this case, to the fortuitous fall of Adam and Eve and the beginning of the human race. This one, Cork Net, is not really a sound poem, but you can see if you were to read it that you'd start with that outer circle, cork, net, and you'd move in, ring, price, net, ring. And what Finlay does, there are only 5 words in the poem, but with each circle, he introduces a new word, and you end with the word fish right in the middle. The cork, of course, Finlay was fascinated by the sea. The cork holds up the fishing net. while the ring keeps the fishing net down in the water. That's why we have these concentric circles. So if you read from outside in, net becomes a pun for fishing net and net price. That is the price obtained from selling the fish. And these fish are caught both in the net and in the innermost circle of the poem. So very characteristic, minimal writing. And this is the last, Finlay in the last poem we'll show you. This poem is called Broken, or Broken, Heartbroken. And this is not a sound poem. This really has to be looked at. It's very visual. And there is a whole kind of semantic suggestion as well. He's using a new treatment of typographic form. By using spaces, the heart empties itself of its contents. It's a broken heart. And broken diminishes one letter at a time. Midway through, broken gradually puts itself back together and becomes a whole word, enclosing the empty heart. Is a broken heart the same as being broken-hearted? That might be a question Finlay is posing as he juxtaposes the beginning of the poem, which is the only complete words, with the last words at the end, broken heart, heart broken. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. I think Sergio has one more question. If you want to move to our last question.
Are we doing okay for time, Peter?
Well, yeah, please take your time.
Okay. So Nancy, we spoke about approaching this idea of the transnational poetics. And one thing that I would like to bring up, just to complicate a little bit your task, is this idea. You just showed three poets that you find that their work is seminal to concrete poetry, that come from very different countries, very different sort of political situation at that time. So when concrete poetry begins in Brazil, there is a wave of hope after a long dictator period, and back to civil society and the construction of Brasilia. And there is a hope in Brazil that the modernization process that it's underway will kind of revert 450 years of colonialism. So this is the situation in Brazil. In Scotland, where Finlay is, he's living in this small farm, and I believe Scotland was devastated during the war period. And the same thing happened in Austria. So when we talk about a poetic that it's transnational, in this moment that it's actually also the beginning of globalization in a sense, a global economy and so forth, how can we kind of conciliate all these kind of differences?
Yeah, that was wonderful. I'm going to be somewhat brief because I realize we want to have questions as well. If people continue to be energetic. But what really struck me was this term transnational. And this was a term that Gerhard Rühm used, translated from the German. So I don't have the original German, but he was interested in the idea of a pared down language, of a simplified world language, so that glossaries might be available for an Anglophone audience, but that language would be pared down, simplified, so that it could be understood across nationalities. And Gerhard Rühm called that transnational. Augusto, there's a really wonderful quote from Augusto that really hits on this same idea of communicating across linguistic barriers. That's what Augusto says. And his quote, which I'll read, and the simple fact that poets of such a little known language as Portuguese were involved in the launching of a movement that exceeded the frontiers of the Western world to project itself all the way to Japan, as we've discussed, in the poetry of Nikuni, Takahashi, and others, shows an uncommon vocation to overcome the linguistic barriers. So I think that quote and Gerhard Rühm's idea of the transnational, another poet who we haven't even mentioned, Ernst Jandl, Austrian, very important poet. He had almost identical words to Augusto's for his goal to transcend the national boundaries. So with that, I think I'm going to close so that we can open up for questions. And Peter's back.
And there are quite a few amassing here. So I have a comment and a question from David Solo. The exhibitions were great and very much looking forward to the book. Following up on the selection discussion, given the subtitle, A 21st Century Anthology, did you consider including 21st century work?
Yes, so the book has a postlude. And in the postlude, I include the Brazilian poet, who I think was part of our audience, André Valias, who works digitally, principally with digital forms, but very literary. Susan Howe, who is, very, very important American poet, the winner of many awards. And she does her own kind of approach to poetry. It's not really concrete poetry, but it does use collage, splicing, and it's also very, very scholarly in the sense that she works with archives and with archival material and photographs sections of poems or texts and then puts them, piecing them together into her poetry. You don't read left to right, and a lot of material is cropped, but you can create relationships between words in a very fascinating way. And then Derek Beaulieu, another figure, very important, very, incredibly active today. His poetry is also part of my postlude. So the postlude, in a very preliminary way, includes the 21st century.
Jim Ferris comments, wonderful talk. Any comments about Kurt Schwitters and his work and influence, the visual and sonic together? Is he represented in the book?
Good question. He is not represented in the book. He is a perfect example of what I was talking about earlier, sound poetry. The Ursanate is a sound poem, and there is a visual in the sense that you have to see the text and you have to see his treatment of this abstract text that he organizes in sonata form with an exposition, a development, a recapitulation. He was, new music, and but he was. And of course, Schwitters was also a visual artist and did collage and assemblage. But the sound poetry that Schwitters did not have a visual component in the way that the other work I covered does. I don't think that was its principal role. He was more interested in abstract sound structured in a particular way, and the German language itself is critical to the way you read Kurt Schwitters. He could have been in it. I mean, in another generation or whatever, maybe I'd put him in, but for now, those were my reasons for not including Schwitters in this particular anthology.
Susan asks, do some of these have a three-dimensional quality?
Let's see. That's a good question. I would say the answer is probably yes. I'm just trying to think of what the best examples would be. I think in a way the Japanese characters for river and sandbank and ocean, there's a bit of, because of the repetition of the characters, there's a bit of a three-dimensional quality to those poems, those characters. And I certainly think when Augusto de Campos moves into digital animation and he's animating sound, he's animating concrete poems and also inserting sound, that what we see on the screen, because the words are actually moving, they do take on a three-dimensional quality as well. So I would say, you know, especially in these animated forms with sound and visual, that and moving letters, that the three-dimensional plays a role. That's very interesting. Yeah.
Kim asks, how do you read, speak, Eye for Eye, the Pop Crete poem by Augusto de Campos?
I'm not sure one speaks it. I think it's olho por olho. Did I pronounce that right, Sergio?
Olho por olho.
Olho por olho. Yeah. It's visual. It's visual. And that's actually a good question because, you know, how is it a concrete poem? I think it's a concrete poem because he's using these images of eyes, and sometimes it's an image of a traffic sign, as kind of surrogates for words. So words play a role. The eye, obviously, seeing, the mouth. Sometimes it's not an eye, it's a mouth. So words play a role, but one wouldn't speak that poem because it doesn't have an actual text. It's more visual. Sergio may want to add to that.
Yeah, that series of poems came out in the mid-1960s, and it's a different phase. It's really a commentary on the press in Brazil. So a lot of the clippings for those collages, they are taken from newspapers and from magazines. You can read, but you read in a cacophonous way. It's just the confusion of you know, when you are in the newsstand and you see 50 things at the same time. So it's that kind of thing. But one interesting thing about that poem that it's fascinating, and I just wrote an essay about that series for a book that Marjorie and David Jackson organized. Is that that is a moment when the Neugandres poets, they are interested in semiotics. And so what Nancy mentioned about, you know, kind of using these icons, it's spot on because they're very interested in how you read not only text, but you read signals and signage and so forth. And the last thing that I want to mention is that particular poem, for me, at least, it kind of it already kind of predicts what Marcel Brothers will do in the 1970s with some of this idea of collages and so forth. So it's a poem that it was a very kind of unique experiment that he did, but it's really powerful and has quite a lot of interesting stories to take from those poems.
John Evans asks, how about Little Sparta itself by Ian Hamilton Finlay for 3D?
That's a good one.
That's the best answer. Absolutely.
And then Nick and Leaf say, you should do a sound poetry book, ! Also, they ask, also perhaps not concrete, but Kamal Braithwaite video Sycorax came to mind. Is there anything from B.P. Nichols in the book? I was under the impression some of his concrete work is difficult to find.
Yeah. There is B.P. Nichols in the book, I think. I mean, I'm now needing to go back and verify myself. There's certainly Bob Cobbing. BP Nichols may have been more in the, I'm just looking at the table of contents, trying to remember, more on the sound poetry side. And these are all, of course, let's see, I'm just going to answer the question. Yeah, so BP Nicol actually isn't in this anthology. Cobbing is. And I think it was because I connected him to Steve McCaffrey and to the poets who were really focused on sound poetry more than they were on concrete poetry.
Okay. And I think we have time for one last question. Andre says, terrific session. Thanks to you both. I appreciate the emphasis on sound and performance, but also seeing these on the page. There must have been a lot of decisions to make in terms of the publication as a book. Some poems are horizontally oriented, some vertical, some need to be turned around and so forth. Could you speak a bit about the process of making the book?
For that, we'd really need the publisher here and the designer. Reaction Books, based in London, did really a marvelous job. And yes, absolutely, there are poems that are vertical. There are poems that, I mean, one of Augusto's most famous poems, Cidade, is an endless, or not endless, but a continued stream of prefixes, roots, I should say, all of which end in city, cidade, cité. And that poem can only be reproduced by moving the words, the roots, I guess you call them, all the way across the pages from one page to the opposite page. So that they did, they were able, and it's a little tricky because when you get to the gutter of the page, you really have to press hard on the book to be able to see those inner letters, but you can do it. And then Finlay experimented a lot with concentric circles, but those reproduce just fine on a square background. So I don't think there was ultimately a lot of trouble with that. I think just where necessary, we needed to use 2 pages rather than 1. And also just be sure that the poems that really needed to be in color were in color, because without color, say for Viva Vaya, for example, it really loses its impact. The red and the white are critical. And for Finlay, as you saw, Happy Apple, Broken Heart, Hearted, those also really benefit from color. So that was another design decision that we wrestled with, and ultimately they were able to produce a lot of color images for the book.
Well, congratulations, and it's really an achievement, and this has been such a delight.
Peter, thank you so much for hosting this and doing the introductions and the question answer. And Sergio, so many thanks for participating with me in this.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Likewise for me. Great pleasure.
Well, and thank you all in the audience for joining us. And I want to remind everybody, you know, City Lights is open for business. We're open 7 days a week from noon until 8 p.m. This event is being made possible by the City Lights Foundation, which continues the legacy of the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti into the future. We hope to see you all again soon. Be safe, be well. Please be well. Take care.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye, Peter. Thank you.
Bye.